On May 10th, 2025, something incredible happened. I, along with other scholar researchers, walked across the stage at American University's School of Education commencement. And in that sacred moment, I was hooded as Dr. Martina Van Norden. What came next? None of us expected. The clip hit TikTok and went viral. The post was one of me in high praise, full of what I call radical joy. The post read, "Whoever's aunt, sister, cousin this is, just want to tell her congratulations on her doctorate degree. I just know it was a long journey." That journey is a collective story of pain, sacrifice, faith, and healing with some of the most passionate, courageous, and brilliant minds. Momentum Conversations is where we share the backstory, the people, the purpose, and the power behind that unforgettable moment. So whether you're showing up with curiosity, courage, or just catching the vibe, I'm glad you're here.
Well, thank you for that invitation to identify and introduce myself. My name is Dr. Rachel Cason. I am a believer in Christ. I am a mother, daughter, sister. I'm a teacher. I am, so we're saying this, a poet, a researcher, and just a lover of all things creative, social justice. Yeah, I'm just excited to be here with you today. This is Leo.
Hi, Leo.
My sidekick and my partner, so he may be popping in and out of the conversation. You say hi?
Hi.
And truly a testimony getting through this doctoral journey. He was by my side early mornings and late nights in class. So Dr. Leo.
He is Dr. Leo. Leo is going to be able to tell people he was in a doctoral program from day one. That's right. From day one, he has a whole lot of aunties and uncles that love him, that have watched him grow. And I love it that we are starting with Leo, Rachel, because he is the reason why I started my research. And we're going to get into, part of that and part of our research, but also we're really giving that backstory to what happened at the commencement of why this even is started with Momentum Conversations. I had to start with you because when you talk about real identity and who you are and, how you show up in places, like Rachel, you were so much a part of that because you called the sister out. And so I had to start with you. But one of the things that I always loved about your relationship with Leo is like he was always just like he is right now, right in the camera, right there, like from infancy, like that was 3 years ago. And when we started this journey, and he was an infant, like you were holding him in class, working the Zoom with him. And he was just there. And as I would look at him and watch him grow over the years, it was always encouraging and inspiring to me. And so it is just so good to see him in this space. This is what God ordained. He wanted Leo to be here in this moment for us to have this conversation because he is such an inspiration to both of our research. So I'm going to just start with, why are we calling this Prophesying Daughters? Because someone is going to look at this and be like, what are they talking about? They went to AU. Like, how is it that they're in the School of Education walking around talking about an episode called Prophesying Daughters? And so I'm going to let you take a stab at what, just like you tell me why you think that is the appropriate name for this episode.
Yeah. So I think around the time that we were working on our knowledge reviews, and just really getting familiar with the existing literature around our topics for our dissertation and practice and our problems of practice that we were addressing, I remember being pointed in the direction of Nannie Helen Burroughs, Anna Julia Cooper, and just that legacy of Black feminist scholarship in DC, where my research was rooted. And so I was on the way to work one day listening to a book talk, a book that the author had written on Nannie Helen Burroughs, and she used the language of prophesying daughters to describe Burroughs and her commitment to the Black theological tradition and the Black intellectual tradition, and how she, for herself, could not distinguish between the two. So she could not separate her identity as a Black woman from her identity as a Christian, and how that not only shaped her lens, like that was her lens for the problems that she was seeking to address, in terms of her work, and then also like her scholarship, which she was writing about. And so immediately I sent it to two people, you and Dr. Moss, who happened to be your chair, one of my committee members who had originally steered me in the direction of Burroughs. And so in thinking about our identities as we were entering into this phase of becoming scholar practitioners, not leaving out our Christian identities, and really that being a place of boldness, and that being a place of being radical. Like, we live in a day and age where it's radical to boldly identify as a Christian, especially when you work in the equity space, in the justice space, identifying strongly and competently as a Christian. It's kind of a radical act these days. And so I think it's also important to emphasize the prophesying nature, because when you're working in the sphere of anti-racism, it's easy to stay focused on the problems. And when you think about like the tradition of Afrofuturism, alongside this idea of being a prophesying daughter, is really taking Jarvis Gibbons' advice and saying to be anti anything is to center that thing which you're trying to get away from. And so it kind of invites in what's on the other side of revolution, right? I'm anti-racist, but I'm pro what? And so the prophesying nature comes in that pro, in terms of speaking things that are not as though they will be, to paraphrase, call to action what we think education should look like, even though it may seem impossible right now.
I love that. And you know, when you talk about that boldly, like centering our faith, and when I received it, first of all, it was like a shock for me to even have like someone say, "Oh, your work is prophetic." Like, to have that centered in the first place was a blessing, because it totally changed the lens upon which I started to write and I started to approach my research. And so I know that it was the invitation of that book, even though Dr. Moss, of course, like as a believer, as a man of God, all of that, he understood I was coming from the positionality of a Christian woman, Black woman. However, it was the book. It's a prophetic anointing that rests that on both of us. And from that point on, we became like prophesying daughters, in that right. Like, that is now how our cohort knows us. When we say prophesying daughters, they're gonna point to Rachel and Martina, because that is our love language now. Be able to speak and declare what God is saying to us as it relates to education, and recognizing that I used to drive down the road, down Nannie Helen Burroughs Road every day to go to work, right? And it is even in that commute, right, that I'm now even hearing you say that we've never had that discussion. The thing I love about Moments of Conversations is we're having conversations that we have not quite had. So when I heard you say that, I was like, wait a minute. It's amazing to me to even hear that, because I'm not knowing at that time that I'm riding in the footsteps and in the lineage and in the legacy of a prophetic voice who was speaking and educating and doing that work then. Did not know that until today. I am today years old on that. So once again, you still continue to teach me, Rachel, because as I was watching you with Leo, I was reminded of myself, of just being a single mom with two boys at that time, and just having to be in space, right? To be able to do what you're doing right now. And what I love about this moment is you are right now, you and Leo are reclaiming it for me, because so often I was afraid of how I would be perceived, right? As this single mother, like, was it going to be the perception of, oh, okay, it's just, another one, like you're the statistic, you when you show up with your situation, or your status, like, is that some man is not, has some black man has done something or has not done something, right? Not about, like, this is what God has placed me because he trusts me, he knows me, like, it was not part of my testimony. And what I love about you, and what made me, like, just lean into you the entire time, you and Leo, was the fact that, like, you were like, no, I'm getting this doctorate while I'm going through personal transitions, but I'm going to go through it in faith, and I'm going to bring in the class, and I'm going to let a village come around my son around this. And so I would love to hear you talk about that, because it's like undeniable. People need to understand that the praise that went out on that stage that day, when they want to know the backstory, these are the backstories. Like, this is you as a young woman having gone through everything. And I know the story, but it's your story to tell. But, like, this little beautiful black boy is sitting in this Zoom right now, in this conversation, and he's here because, like, his mom was like, no, I'm not quitting, I'm not stopping. So you have to talk about that.
As you were talking, I started thinking about what were some of the things that I had to unlearn in the process. And there was definitely a point where the doctorate felt like a point of validation. Like, okay, I may be divorced, I may be a single mom, but I'm a doctor, right? Like, when I register my son for school, our last names might not match anymore, but at least they'll see doctor in front of my name. And so they won't count him out because they'll think he just came from another young single mom. Or like, I'm not a spring chicken, but sometimes I have like a little bit of a baby face. And so sometimes I'm like, oh, people are going to look at me and think that, like, I'm just some teenage mom or something like that. But, like, I got a bag that says doctor. And so I say that to say, as much as it is a testimony, a part of the testimony is the unlearning that I have to have a certain status to be worthy of respect and dignity, right? Like, because I'm a Black woman, it doesn't mean I have to have these letters to prove. Now, there are some instances where being strategic and navigating systems, it helps to have doctor in front of my name. It does give a certain level of credibility, a certain level of protection when I think about how positions are being phased out and organizations are being forced to restructure, given the political climate that we're in right now. It does help to have doctor in front of my name as a point of protection for my job. But in terms of who Rachel is and what she's worthy of, in terms of respect, who Leo is and where he comes from, who he comes from, I had to unlearn that idea that I needed a certain status. And the other thing I thought of as you were talking is a big part of my methodology was poetry, interpreting the poetry written by a group of fourth and fifth grade Black girls at my school. But I also wrote poems as a part of my, like, reflexivity system to check how I was making sense of what they were saying, and just to check in with myself through the journey. And so in my dissertation, there is some poetry that I authored as well. And there's this recurring motif during that season of writing of the image of a phoenix. I wrote a lot about phoenixes rising from the ashes and just like the healing journey, because as I was working with these girls on repairing or developing their own math identity, and with this group of Black women educators who were healing from the various pressures of being a Black woman in a school space as a teacher, even reflecting on their experiences as students, and that collective healing, I realized that because I was in a lot of pain at that time, I was ripe to listen for pain, for where there was pain. And so I say that to say, now I shared with a friend, I'm not writing from a place of pain anymore, and that's weird for me. I think that's part of the testimony, but it's new territory, because it's easy to produce poetry from pain, from sorrow, from hurt, from grief. But to now listen for and write from a place of joy and peace, and every day's not perfect, but just noticing even the differences in myself, and how this journey was a great way to document not just the academic research, but the personal journey of healing as well.
I had the hashtag for this is radical joy journey, because that was what it was. It was a journey to radical joy. And we talked in even the last episode as well about it was actually a healing space. I mean, I don't know how many people have a doctoral program become a healing platform for them, but so many of us use our work to be an internal work where we were putting a certain practice in place through our intervention and through our study. But what was key was, like you said, the reflexivity of looking at yourself and saying, wait a minute, am I really doing justice to the people who I am participating and co-researching with? Am I doing justice to their story, to their journey, if I am not able to find that joy in my own? And I know that was such a big deal for me in doing my work. Was I have to get something out of this besides just a title, right? I did not want to be one of those who got a doctorate as a Black woman and then still was seeking something else, looking for something else. Like, I knew there was going to be more after it, but the doctoral journey for me led to joy. It was the joy of the relationships that I had created with my cohort, with professors, with instructors, with guests, with co-researchers, all of that. It was also the joy of seeing my own evolution in healing. And I think that one of the beauties of watching it was we were all of different generations, right? So it's like, oh, you had someone from 75 to 22, 23 in the program. And in that spectrum, we all were on a healing journey in some shape, form, or fashion. We were healing from systemic harm, injustice. We were healing from personal harm, internal. And so, I love it that you talked about like the poetry as part of your methodology. And, you have some amazing poetry that like blew me away. I'm just saying. When you sent it to me, it was like, Martina, read this, right? Like, read this so you know where we're going. And I don't think any of us came out of our dissertation process without referring to bell hooks. I just don't know how any of us did. Like, we all leaned into her work and her words on love. Her work just changed so much of how I was looking at systems, particularly patriarchal systems, as it related to Black boys. And from the right, Leo. That's right. That's right. I told you he's a full doctoral scholar already. But I want you to talk a little bit about like how Black feminist pedagogy played a part. Like, oh, and first of all, I forgot to say, I need you to say the title of your research because, and look, if mine is so long, I can't even remember it sometimes. So I'll find it. I'll find it and I'll say it for you.
I got you. The title of my dissertation was Toward a Humanizing Math Feedback Protocol, a CPAR study with Black women math educators in a DC charter school. A mouthful.
Mouthful. But it's so much. And I mean, so you also did a DC charter school, which, is close to my heart because that was the last assignment, and I call it an assignment. My last assignment in DC that was memorable. I wrote a book about it, about my experience in that, and have two godsons out of that school, out of the relationship. So once again, DC charter schools just are part of my work. And so I would love for you to talk about like just how that Black feminist pedagogy, how did that talk to me about that. Tell us about your research and how that comes into play in how you are approaching your next, like the next part of your journey.
Yeah, I think that I was really privileged that the context, like the demographics of the school that I worked at, really aligned with this idea of Black women as experts, right? I was working at a charter school, researching at a charter school, where at the time the director of STEM was a Black woman. The math instructional coach for the grade band I was working with, a Black woman. All of the math teachers in that grade band, Black women. A Black woman was running for president. A Black woman was principal of the school. And so there was a ripe context to be centering Black women, not just as research participants, but as the experts driving the research. And so that aligned with the idea of counter narrative and storytelling, please, as well as one of my anchoring theories, which is Black feminist mathematics pedagogies. There are 4 tenets that are central to that. One of the main ones that I focused on was critical consciousness and reclamation. And it's this idea that we have to create space within math education for Black girls' conscious spirits to thrive. And so as I read more deeply into that tenet, I started to ask myself, well, if we don't create space through our systems of coaching and development for the conscious spirits of teachers to thrive, then how can they make space in their classrooms for the conscious spirits of their students, namely their Black girl students, to thrive? And so Black feminist thought, Black feminist pedagogy really drove my theory of action in terms of creating an intentional space within the school day, not an aside, but saying this is part of our organizational obligation to you as a Black woman working here, to create space for affinity, identity affirmation, and this work of deepening your critical consciousness. And so in her book, Making Black Girls Count in Math Education, the same scholar behind Black feminist mathematics pedagogies, Dr. Nicole Joseph, pretty much says here's 3 action steps for teachers who are ready to like go for broke to make sure that Black girls feel honored and affirmed in their math classrooms. And she said the first step is critical racial identity. The second step was a deep understanding of Black girlhood. And then the third step is critical reflection on math instruction. And so we said, let's do it. Let's make a weekly coaching meeting, all Black women math educators. We're going to look at these girls' poems. We're going to read Zaretta Hammond's work on culturally responsive feedback, and then we're going to leave space for like whatever's there, what arises, so that we can collectively make sense of why we're giving feedback the way that we give it and how it's impacting these girls, and then what shifts can we make. So it really was action research, but it was that critical participatory action research, because I wasn't saying that I'm the expert as the researcher. There was a collective expertise that was rooted and grounded in a belief in the legacy of Black women educators like Burroughs, like Anna Julia Cooper, as like knowing instinctively what needs to be done next if you give us the space to do it.
So tell me what you. So I'm a mom. I wanted to know, like, how to translate this to this kind of context, this kind of lens to my daughter's teacher. What would I say? Where would I start? How would I get them to know, like, that my daughter is possibly struggling or not connecting or not leaning into STEM the way that she should. She shows a desire, but in the classroom or in the educational system, that is not showing up the same way. How would I take your research and present it as something that the teacher should consider or look into? How would you suggest I would do that?
Yeah, so I think one thing that's important that came out in my findings, and that is in the existing literature on math identity, is that academic achievement, math competence are not indicators of strong math identity, such that I could be scoring off the charts and still feel like I don't belong in math because of like my identities, my experiences, or how I'm receiving feedback, experiencing the environment. So I would start there, because that's important, because there are girls who might go overlooked. The main data point that I was trying to change with this intervention was Black girls telling me that when they make a mistake, it doesn't feel safe because they have to pull themselves back up. So the first thing as a parent that I would have to interrogate is, what happens when she makes a mistake here? How am I responding? And are there instances where, because she's well behaved, she's quiet, she's getting good grades, that I'm not checking in with how she's processing what it feels like to make mistakes? Because as I was doing the research, I thought about it. I was like, I was in AP calculus. Like, I was really good at math. And yet, in being a high achiever, I still experienced that same pressure of like, I can't make a mistake because my worth was attached to these achievements, accomplishments. So if I made a mistake, then I wasn't who I thought I was, because I had to be perfect. So that's the one thing that I would start with. Don't count anybody out from this data set because of their high achiever, or assume that, oh, this research is only applicable to like struggling math learners, right? The second thing that I started writing about is, we have these systems where parents interact with the teachers to get updates on their students' data, whether it be an IEP meeting or a multi-tiered student supports MTSS meeting, or just a regular parent-teacher conference, right? How can I, as a parent, be collecting artifacts from my child so that when I show up to the meeting, I can actually say to the teachers, oh, okay, well, thank you for sharing that. Here's some data of my own that I've brought, so that I'm really positioned to advocate for my daughter, and to know, like, well, if you interact with her in this way, you might get this response. But like, if you interact with her in another way, you get a different response. And what someone at my dissertation defense called it was, oh, your research speaks to love languages. Like, you're actually interpreting what makes girls feel safe through their own love languages, because they would say things in the poems like, when I made a mistake, my teacher, she helped me until I got it right. It felt like someone killing a bug for me. Well, that's acts of service, right? When I made a mistake, it felt like getting a hug from my mom. That's physical touch. And of course, within schools, there are boundaries to how we can show love through these love languages. But counting that as important data when we're making decisions about students is what this work invites in, whether it be a teacher advocating to higher ups or a parent advocating to the school. It just positions the girl's voice and their reflections as key data that should be considered in decision making and in measuring the teacher's effectiveness.
Here's the prophetic state that we as a community of educators have a responsibility now in this time to reimagine and redefine what parental and community engagement looks like. It is not just academic skill, it is competence, right? It's capacity, it is safety, it is the very basics of, like, every educator knows Maslow's hierarchy, right? Is that personal safety that sits at the foundation, that as a community having responsibility, especially a community of faith. So I'm leaning now and taking everything that you said into this prophetic statement of not being able to separate my belief, my position as a Christian from being an educator, from being a mother. I can't separate those things. I can't cut off my faith when I'm sitting there looking at a child that I know I am supposed to speak life into that child as an educator. I can't just cut off my faith and my belief system when I'm looking at a mother's struggle. And I can't limit that to, okay, I just have to talk to you about your child's ability to check the box off that they know how to do multiply 2-digit numbers, right? That skill in itself, it will develop. But I am suggesting that your research, prophetically making this statement, that your research is also for the parent and the village to come around how our children are even sharing about their education. We'll first ask a child, how are you doing in school? What are your grades? Right? But what if we took some of what you have already implemented as part of your research and put it in the context of a community engagement around their learning in school? What if we started to ask, how do you feel when you don't get it right? How do you feel when you do know the answer, but you can't respond? I am now suggesting that your research, as it applies to my research, which is community engagement, civic education, what does it look like? It is not just going down a skill checklist of what our children can do, but it is about cultivating safe spaces where our children can hear the affirmations, the corrections, and make connections to their learning experience. So that's a lot to simply say. Prophetically, I think your research needs to be something that every parent, every community member hears, because for me to pull those artifacts, how amazing would it be if I just said, write a poem about how you felt in math class today, right? So write a sentence, say something to me about how it makes you feel about yourself. I want you to talk about that, because I see that being the place where the role of the educator, the caregiver, or the community member can interpret things and nurture conversations. And you mentioned that in your research. So I want you to talk a little bit about that.
The first thing that I'm thinking of in listening to you is that it's really asking whatever audience, whether that is the educators, to your point, the families, the extended community members, to really dig into the learning sciences. I think that was something that I didn't expect that this would be a direction that I would go, but when I think about my own interest, it makes a lot of sense, especially with my background in special education. Like, this isn't SEL. This is actually neuroscience. This is the brain cannot learn unless these baseline conditions exist. So it's not even emotional safety, like, oh, I felt happy in math today, or I felt sad in math today. It is your brain body safety threat detection system, such that when I show up in certain spaces, whether it be based off of past experiences or internalized messages from whatever source that I'm getting messages from, that let me know that this environment is psychologically safe, that this environment is welcoming, that I will experience belonging here, or that this environment is threatening. And so when the brain and body perceive the environment to be threatening, then there are behaviors that we see, like shutting down, opting out, a lack of task initiation, learned helplessness. I'm not going to do this work unless you're sitting here next to me. And that's that understanding of the learning sciences and the neuroscience that's behind this idea of psychological safety as an essential condition for learning. That is where we can take cues in terms of what are the appropriate next steps, to your point around moving just from data that assesses skill to data that assesses the culture of learning, the learning partnerships that we're able to create with students. Because I might think I'm being a great teacher because I go and sit next to a student every single day. But then when it comes to their independent practice, their test scores, they're not able to perform and show what I know to be true of their intellectual capacity. But that's because I actually have over scaffolded, because I didn't understand that I was reinforcing learned helplessness because I wasn't grounded in interpreting the student's experience of psychological safety. So I'm actually robbing them of a learning experience and reinforcing the idea of you can't do it without me. So this is about taking data from students to then create space for them to flourish and maximize their intellectual capacity. I hope you heard any of this.
We heard it. We heard it. We heard it. And Leo is just your amen corner, Dr. Rachel. That's so. And once again, I want to highlight to those watching the beauty of your mother. The reason why I love it that you have Leo and you're saying these things is because, like we said, momentum conversations are the real, authentic, genuine. This is what it looks like. This is what you literally did during our program, and we were like, Rachel's gonna drop something, so we're gonna love Leo while she's talking, because that is the reality of many of us as parents. We want to be able to get the information, and if you have to wait until that ideal moment, you miss the opportunities to be able to glean. And so that's the beauty of technology now, right? You're doing this now, and Leo's going to be able to see this one day and be able to say, like, no, this is why I know what I know about education, because I've been receiving it a whole time. But and it's also a representation of what our families are really experiencing. They are working, they are raising a family, they're doing all of this, and they want to be present in their children's lives. And we are trying to make that accessible to them by giving them this information to say, hey, listen, it's just your child is not learning, not because your child can't learn, your child, or because your child doesn't want to learn. It could just be that you have to take some time and look into, like you said, the neurological. Without that brain making those connections, everything else is not going to work. And we're now in a time, educators are now going to be faced with even more pressure than ever, because we're seeing the political climate has shifted. and there's going to be less resource. So we're going to have to more. How did I let a child sit in a math classroom all this time and not know the anxiety, the fears, the psychological challenge that they were having? And I, as the teacher, was putting them in that environment, right? Like, when you own that responsibility as a teacher, and then you sit back and say, oh, wow, like, there's some healing that has to be done afterwards. I can go down this to say that is directly related to my research, which speaks to why Black men and their engagement in the school system, and it is because they have been so, as boys in the school, there has not been that psychological safety. They have been so abused, mistreated, misappropriated, misaligned in their classroom settings, and they didn't have anyone. They didn't have a Dr. Rachel or Dr. Martina to say, wait a minute, hold on, what is going on here that we need to pull back from and start to look at? So for all that you're putting out, this is a question I had to ask you, and I can't wait to hear you ask this question with Leo in your arms. You talk about Black girls, and one of the things you all looked at me and you were like, Martina, why are you doing Black boys when you're a Black woman? Like, it was so funny. And I was like, yeah, I know. Like, it's, one would think I would have leaned into the Black woman educator, because I love y'all, love Black women, as like love that part of my identity. But as a mom, I was like, I have to do something, because I know there was a lot of instances where my sons were unsafe, where I did not advocate for them in those educational spaces. And so, Dr. Rachel, I want to hear you say or talk about, you've done this work with girls. What is that going to look like when you talk to Leo's teachers? What do you think that would
Talk to his teachers about my research or about him as a learner?
him as a learner?
Okay. So when I think about how I would use this system or this methodology with boys, what's been coming up just from, because, all of this comes from observation, right? Like, we didn't wake up one day and say, I want to talk about boys because that's what I want to talk about, or I'll research girls because today's Tuesday and that's how I feel. We are coming to these problems that we're addressing and intervening on based on like real observations and environmental scans. And so when I did my environmental scan, the girls were in need in this particular area as it related to the practice of feedback. When I think about how I would use this as methodology based on my observations of my male students, as well as the poems that the boys submitted, because when we did the intervention, all of the students in 4th and 5th grade wrote the poems. We just analyzed the poems of the girls, but as the researcher, I read everyone's. And in looking at the boys' poems, it's not the tone of feedback that they're receiving or the quality of feedback so much. The boys reflect more on, and they don't have this language, but as an educator, I have the language. It's their executive functioning, right? And so I would use the poetry as a way to invite in pause, because a lot of the boys, and particularly I work with boys with ADHD or learning disabilities, there's an impulsivity that we don't explicitly teach. We say they lack impulse control, but we haven't taught that self-regulation explicitly. And so I would use the poems, whether it be with Leo or just for greater research related to Black boys, around how are we inviting in pause systemically? How are we creating space for them to track and regulate their own learning behaviors? A lot of times we look at boys and we look at their behaviors. They're out of their seat. They're talking a lot. They're loud. They're blurting out. That's all impulsivity, but it can be connected to their learning, right? So how do I then create a space in which they're allowed to self-regulate, but they're also allowed to learn in the ways that they learn? Leo is definitely a movement-based, a kinesthetic, tactile, hands-on kind of learner. And so he'll have to be in an environment that honors that and gives him space to reflect on that, own that, name that for himself. One of the other theories that grounded my research was culturally responsive poetry. And Dr. Jennifer Nicole Bacon talks about how poetry invites the student, in particular, her research was with African-American adolescent girls, but allows them to name and define their own experiences. And so if we have a generation of boys who grows up and they're allowed to name and define their experiences, and in turn we honor that, then we're preparing a generation of men who have emotional intelligence to then be who it is that they're supposed to be in whatever roles that they occupy. And so I think that's also part of the prophetic nature, that we're setting up a system now that says you name and define who you are and what your experiences are, and we'll treat you like the expert on your own experiences and honor and affirm that. I think it's important as well because we talk a lot in education about bringing in a student's lived experience as if their lived experience is just something that happens outside of school. Most kids spend most of their time in school. I have some students who are there from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. What happens at school is their lived experience, and their lived learning experiences are something that is worth documenting. And so Leo will grow up knowing that his learning experiences matter. And so to your point, how will I translate that to his teachers? I will use the fact that I am an educator as well, obviously, as an entry point to that conversation.
I think that is amazing. Amazing. The other thing you have to talk about before we end is Gethsemane monologue. I'm just gonna leave that there. I'm not even gonna talk about it. I'm just gonna mention Gethsemane monologue and let you go.
I really want to know what your questions are about it, though. Like, you read it. I'll give context as to what it is, why it's important to me, and how it connects to this idea of Black feminist intellectual tradition and Black theological tradition. Basically, it's a work in progress. I've created these characters. Maybe it'll be a play, maybe it'll be a novel, who knows. I needed some creative writing that wasn't scholarly writing, but it really centers this idea of an origin story of this female prophetess who was enslaved, betrayed, lynched, and she's kind of like a Black female Lazarus situated in the time period of American slavery. And the story is really told through the perspective of this girl in the 60s who has gotten into this altercation at school with a Black male student who is a member of the Nation of Islam. And he's telling her, like, how could you be a Christian? Like, that's the white man's religion. And she is now telling him, like, how her beliefs are really rooted and grounded in this oral tradition from the women in her family around this Black woman who came back from the dead and was prophesying about, like, who God was to her. And so it's really basically saying Christianity is not the white man's religion, it's actually the Black woman's religion. And that was important to me in considering my own role as a scholar practitioner situated in this Black feminist tradition and Black theological tradition. How do we interrogate, like, the patriarchy, the misogynoir that exists within the Black church without letting it be a crippling, stifling point? And so, like, whose testimony is really grounding our beliefs and our faith?
You want to know what I was thinking of? Definitely the storytelling element, right, of it. As I read and I thought about how we as prophesying daughters, when we get in our quiet space, I felt like that was what I was hearing. I felt like I was hearing the quietness the in the quietness, I should say it that way. I the conversation that happens in the quietness, right? Of when I oftentimes will experience something, and Rachel, after it's over, I'll say, "Oh, I wish I could have said. I wish I could have shared. I wish I could have expressed." And I found in this monologue that you were writing, and it was coming through, was like the things that were unspoken oftentimes, that I was alone, and as I was reading it with on paper as you were writing, that's why I said to you, I was like, this right here, like, it was bringing up for me, I think, deep spiritual awareness of the conversations, the self-talk that often goes unspoken, unwritten, unheard. Even in these conversations, it is my heartfelt desire to like bring to the table the authenticity of like who we are. Yes, you can go into the dissertation, you can go Google whatever. That's there. And it's valuable. But the things that were unspoken, the things that were unsaid, the backstory to our presence, our existence, how do we receive the prophetic declaration? I've sat here and said to you, like, your research has the power. It doesn't can have, it has the power to really sit back and be the practice that is put in place that really brings forth the next scientists, the creatives that have been marginalized. Your practice, that's what makes it anti-racist, in the sense that it says, come from outside of the margins, and come and let me start to lift you up and promote you, and to put you on a platform for you to be seen. That is what your practice does. It challenges the educator to say, wait a minute, stop and get out of yourself. Get out of the system's press for you to do this, and really take the time to sit in the reflection of your work. And then when you get alone and you reconcile how I've shown up today, how have I dealt with my emotions, my feelings, my heart, my soul, my spirit? How has it all come together? And then what is the story I will tell? That is what Gethsemane monologues came off to. That's how it hit me. It hit me as, yes, this, you tell of the character that you're writing about, but for me, it was, wait a minute, like, what if I really could, in my faith and in my position as an educator, right? Like, this position now as a mom, as a Black woman, as momentum, all of this, what if I really can sit in that and then tell the story about it? And so Gethsemane monologue was very similar to the heart and the spirit of Momentum Conversations. It was, how do you take this person who has been captive, locked in, hidden, bound, and give them a platform to actually come out and be released and be in liberation and to tell the story of how they made it, how they came out, how they went through, how did I get to this radical joy place? And I think that is important. It is important to make the connection through generations, Rachel, to be able to have the intergenerational conversation that literally says, okay, this is what was for this generation, but this is what it's for the now, for this next generation. And how do we make all of that connect? How do we connect the slave girl to Leo? How do we connect the little slave boy to the, how does it all relate? How does it all connect? And I think that's to me was the Gethsemane monologue was representing all of that.
Have you seen For Colored Girls?
Yes.
So the narration style is modeled off of that. So it's a collection of like 5 monologues, because at any point you could be any one or all of these women. And so there's a character named Ray who's going to the secret like meeting where everyone's gathered to hear Hazel's return story, and Ray is carrying her baby boy. She's strapped to him, and so she talks about like, I heard the story of the woman who killed her sons so they wouldn't have to live in slavery, but like, I can't do that. I can't kill him. So like, he has to live in freedom, even if we're in this enslaved condition, or if that means I got to run, then we're going to run. And so that is where I like artistically put Leo into this story, because it's like, all right, kid, it's me and you. Like, we're both making it out alive. So how are we going to do this with joy and with freedom? But like with curiosity, right? Because she approaches it as like, I don't know if I believe Hazel's story that she rose from the dead, but I'm curious and I want to know.
But there is a resurrection story in what we're living right now.
That is
in our resurrection story right now, Rachel. Like, that's why I said momentum conversations is for the Lazarus to speak. It is for we are they. Okay, we are the ones. A divorce, they say, is like a death. The grieving, that means now I have to be resurrected again. I have to be resurrected into my individual singleness self. That is what you did. You are Dr. Rachel because you came out of that with a new being, not a new being, but a new version of yourself. I am Dr. Martina because I came out of a hiding, out of a deep, dark space, and then coming back and saying, I was just prophetic. And there was the things that I was saying 15 years ago they are now, and I'm watching Rachel live in the now of what I said. So the prophet then was resurrected. So we are the resurrections. We are living it right now, and we are the testimonies of like, you can overcome. You can come out of that place of darkness, like you said, from writing poetry of just sadness or sorrow and grief to, okay, there is a joy that really does come in the morning. There is the ability to speak to your situation and say what it will be when you don't see it, and it will come to pass. We do have the power to prophesy to our situations, and what we are just saying in this, we're prophesying to an educational institution, right? We're prophesying to systems and powers. Well, that's what we're supposed to do, because he said there's going to be, these are principalities in high places that we have to prophetically speak to and tear them down, because they are coming to kill and destroy. So our prophetic declarations are coming out of our resurrection power. They're coming out of the place we have through, and now and they cannot turn us around. They can't stop us from speaking. They can't stop us from loving our children, loving our community, loving ourselves. We are back. No, I know your work, Rachel, is cutting edge. This is, a double-edged sword, right? Like, it's biblical, it is foundational, it is fundamental, because you are going to the core of who God created these little girls to be. They were created in his image, and he is everything. And your research gives a lens to how do you go deeper? How do you take your practice deeper to be able to know how to reach that young girl who was made by God, who has purpose? And so I am excited. I know, like I said, this is just to give the spotlight onto what it is, but I know that there's more to come from us. This has been amazing. It has been awesome to have Leo with us as part of this journey. And like I mean, I just loved having him here with us. And I'm looking forward to the next and the next, because there's going to always be something. We are always going to have these prophesying daughter conversations. So is there anything you want to close with?
I think there's a couple things I would close with. First is just thank you for the invitation and for being yourself and letting it flow authentically. I actually feel very energized now leaving the conversation, although I may seem a little more mellow. The other thing I would say is we just have a responsibility, we have a responsibility to infuse this identity into our work, which means we have a responsibility to keep writing, right? Like the Prophesying Daughter is about reshaping the intellectual tradition. And I'm thinking of the scripture in Micah 6:8, where I think the prophet pretty much says, what do you require of us? And he says to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. And I think that we don't take these titles of doctors as an opportunity to boast in our own strength, but to continue to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. And I think that if there's anything I would want anyone to remember of my work, is that it's about interrogating what is our default setting, right? Is my default a sense of fear, urgency, and accountability politics, or is my default love? And when my default is love, and I'm positioned not to just only be focused on an emotional experience, but to be strategic and responsive. And I think it's important to have that language of responsiveness, of love as a pedagogical stance in a social political climate where we might not be able to continue to say culturally responsive, right? Like that may become criminal,
right?
But if we are really this Christian nation that we are putting forward to be, and saying love is a political act, right? It's a stance. And I just look forward to continuing to talk about this, to write about this, and to put this into practice. So thank you.
You are so welcome. And I'm going to end with Prophesying Daughters, but it says, prophesying, on the other hand, is not just about difference, but also about justice. It is not just about interpreting text, but also about understanding and furthering social change. Furthermore, the very act of writing is prophetic. The texts by the Black women preachers under study were written according to the writers to edify, change, and comfort. And so I am going to just say that is the commission for us. Keep writing, keep prophesying, keep working, and the work continues. So that's the end of this episode of Momentum Conversations, and join us for the next